The British wars in Afghanistan during the 19th century were among the most controversial and destructive chapters of imperial warfare. While mainstream British commentators of the era largely framed these invasions in terms of civilizing missions, strategic necessity, or defensive measures against Russian expansion, Friedrich Engels took a drastically different view. His writings on Afghanistan, though not filling many volumes, reveal a sharply critical and analytically distinct perspective rooted in his broader critique of imperialism and capitalist expansion. In the summer of 1857, as the British Empire was struggling to maintain its grip over India during the Great Uprising, what would later be called the Indian Rebellion, Friedrich Engels sat down to write a concise but devastating account of another imperial misadventure, Britain's war in Afghanistan. Engels got down to dissecting the military, political, and financial folly of Britain's earlier occupation of Afghanistan between 1839 and 1842. His analysis, published in the New American Cyclopedia, is one of the earliest Marxist commentaries on what we might now call imperial overreach in Central Asia. To fully grasp Engels' critique, it's essential to understand the context of Britain's actions. In the early 19th century, Afghanistan was not yet a fully unified nation-state, but a patchwork of tribal and regional powers, loosely ruled by monarchs from the Durrani dynasty. Britain, meanwhile, was tightening its hold over its South Asian empire, the Raj. British officials had grown deeply anxious about Russian expansion across Central Asia. This rivalry, known as the Great Game, pushed both empires into a contest for influence over the buffer zones between their respective spheres. Engels set the context for Afghanistan in these words. The geographical position of Afghanistan and the peculiar character of the people invest the country with the political importance that can scarcely be overestimated in the affairs of Central Asia. The government is a monarchy, but the king's authority over his high-spirited and turbulent subjects is personal and very uncertain. The kingdom is divided into provinces, each superintended by a representative of the sovereign, who collects the revenue and remits it to the capital. The Afghans are a brave, hardy, and independent race. They follow pastoral or agricultural occupations only, eschewing trade and commerce, which they contemptuously resign to Hindus and to other inhabitants of towns. With them, war is an excitement and a relief from the monotonous occupation of industrial pursuits. The British feared that Russia might ally with Afghan rulers or even march towards the Khyber Pass and into the Raj. In response, they launched what would become the First Anglo-Afghan War, aiming to replace the existing Afghan ruler, Dost Muhammad Khan, with Shah Shuja Durrani, a former monarch more pliant to British interests. Engels outlines what happened next with surgical clarity. At first, the plan seemed to work. British forces took Kabul in 1839, installed Shah Shuja, and proclaimed victory. But the occupation was shallow. As Engels writes, the conquest of Afghanistan seemed accomplished, but insurrection followed on insurrection in every part of the country. The Afghan population rejected the puppet regime. British garrisons, isolated and complacent, found themselves surrounded by hostile forces. In 1841, full-scale rebellion erupted in Kabul. Shuja Shah was assassinated, and in 1842, a British army of over 16,000 men and camp followers attempted to retreat from Kabul to Jalalabad. Only one British doctor, William Brydon, made it alive to tell the tale. Engels doesn't dramatize this massacre. He simply presents it as the logical consequence of imperial arrogance. A population that Britain assumed could be bought or coerced into loyalty instead chose resistance with a ferocity the British had underestimated. Engels described the retreat from Afghanistan in a memorable passage. On the 5th of January, the British marched out. 4,500 combatants and 12,000 camp followers. One march sufficed to dissolve the last remnant of order and to mix up soldiers and camp followers in one hopeless confusion, rendering all resistance impossible. The cold and snow and the want of provisions acted as in Napoleon's retreat from Moscow. But instead of Cossacks keeping a respectful distance, the British were harassed by infuriated Afghan marksmen, armed with long-range matchlocks, occupying every height. Engels notes the heavy cost. The occupation of Afghanistan cost the Indian treasury about £1,250,000 per annum, in an era when that sum was vast. The British response to this defeat was to launch punitive expeditions, burning Kabul's Grand Bazaar and temporarily reasserting control before retreating entirely. By the time Engels was writing in 1857, Afghanistan had reasserted its independence. Dost Muhammad Khan had returned to the throne. Britain's attempt to shape Afghan politics through force had failed utterly. Engels acknowledged the internal divisions of rival tribal leaders and the absence of a centralized state in Afghanistan. But he made clear that British failure wasn't due to Afghan disunity. It was due to imperial hubris. British administrators believed that they could bend local politics to their will, as they had done in India. Engels saw Afghanistan not as a land-needing civilization, as British newspapers suggested, but as a graveyard for imperial ambitions. The British forces were not welcomed. They were resisted. Their local allies were not legitimate. They were puppets. And their victories were not sustainable. They were illusions. Engels' writing on Afghanistan is also notable for its silence on religious or civilizational justifications. He does not portray the British as bearers of modernity or the Afghans as trapped in barbarism. Instead, he focuses squarely on material interests, Britain's strategic concerns in India, its fear of Russian competition, and its economic calculations. In this sense, Engels anticipated many later critiques of empire that would emerge in the 20th century. His article also reflects a deeper truth about colonial warfare, that what begins as a limited intervention often spirals into a long and unwinnable conflict. The First Anglo-Afghan War lasted 3 years but left scars that persisted for decades. It showed how little control even the most powerful empire had when it stepped into unfamiliar and unwelcoming terrain. Engels was writing during a moment when the British Empire was beginning to crack in other places as well. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 had just begun, a revolt he and Marx would later analyze as a crisis of British exploitation. The lessons of Afghanistan, then, fit into the larger narrative that foreign domination inevitably breeds resistance and that imperial violence is never as surgical or controlled as its architects imagined. Engels, writing in the 1850s, had already understood the basic dynamic. A powerful empire, guided by strategic anxiety, overextends itself into a hostile environment, underestimates local resistance, and suffers a humiliating retreat.